So I created the thesis. All right, so let's X this out. I thought of a phrase, sarcastic aplomb, sort of a sarcastic tone, but granting him respect, because aplomb is like, um, just like kind of like verve, like you have a lot of, energy, and you're specific, and you just do it well. It's very deft. It's giving someone credit for being a good communicator and being adept and deft at communication, especially written communication. Aplomb, performing something well. Sarcastic aplomb. Um, so here's a version of the thesis that I like, and it's simple. Not every thesis has to be an award winner, or just really nuanced. Um, in parts 1 and 2 of his essay on criticism, as evidenced by his rhyming and word choice and overall snarky, sarcastic tone, Alexander Pope maligns the critic much more harshly than the writer. How else could we say this? We could say, as evidenced by his rhyming and word choice and overall snarky, sarcastic tone. I could say snarky, sarcastic aplomb, but that's sort of, I'm saying that he has aplomb, not that he has an overall snarky tone. Um, and yeah, an overall. Um, that are presented through the lens. But tone is kind of, you hear it, and then lens is kind of, you see it, so it's a little bit confusing. The evidence was remaining worships that are presented to an overall snarky, sarcastic tone. Because we want to talk about the literary terms. So rhyming and word choice are literary terms. So you usually want to go straight for the literary terms. I mean, when you're writing literary essays, that's normally what you want to do. You want to talk about how onomatopoeia proves this, or imagery proves that. That's usually like a safe, way to attack it, or the language, or you could talk about plot too. Characters, the denouement, the plot points. I mean, there's so many things you could talk about. But I try to go real base hit right down the middle. Especially this one, I think the poem is pretty interesting, and there's just a lot there to unpack, and there's so many wonderful, rich quotes. I mean, Alexander Pope was amazing, and his stuff holds up. I mean, we still use a lot of his quotes just in day-to-day life. They're some of them have become sort of trite cliches, but they're very popular cliches, and they've stood the test of time. And they're in this poem. So, as evidenced by his rhyming and word choice that are presented through an overall snarky, sarcastic tone. Yeah, I like that. His rhyming is presented through blank, this tone. His word choice is presented through this tone. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so Alexander Pope. So we can just say poet Alexander Pope maligns, speaks ill of, critic much more harshly. And let's capitalize this. Okay. I like this. Even though It's not as sophisticated as the one that we did for drum taps, Walt Whitman's drum taps, first those songs for a prelude. Um, if we can argue it, it's much better to have something that's a little bit more, I don't want to say generic, but it's just a little bit more elementary or sort of basic than something that's a little bit more nuanced. And even the drum taps one was pretty straightforward. I mean, if you look at all of his language, I mean, everything sort of added to that. It was a really obvious thesis statement, like, you know, and yeah, obviously, if you decide to like spend hours and hours and days and think about, or you just think extremely fast and you could just think about, all these different thesis statements. That's fine. Or maybe some research, or maybe you know listening to the lecture and hearing your professor or teacher to articulate potential themes and angles that would give you some fodder for creating a different thesis statement. This is just stuff that just based on the content, based on what I'm reading, um, these are just the obvious ones that I feel like that they're you know um, that they're things that we can argue well, and that's what you want to do. You want to have a thesis where there's so much material there, so many quotes that just aim at your thesis that you have too much. You have to trim. You don't want to like stretch. That's the thing. You don't want to like really stretch. Like, oh, I don't have enough. I only have enough for a 4-page paper, but I got to write an 8-page paper. Like, you don't want that. You want to be able to write a 30-page paper, but you're just gonna pick enough quotes to write a 6-page or an 8-page paper. So, what do you guys think about this? I think I'd rather not have the offsetting hyphens in the thesis. So, as evidenced by his rhyming and word choice that are presented through an overall snarky, sarcastic tone. So, again, we're gonna defend rhyming. So, all of our stuff is gonna be rhymes and word choice. And even though it's simple, rhyming and word choice, rhyming is a literary term. Um, Same thing with word choice. I think word choice worked, for our last thesis statement as well. So, uh, uh, overall snarky, sarcastic tone. To an overall, we could use snarky and sarcastic. Snarky and sarcastic are sort of synonyms. Um, we'll think about leaving it in or not. Um, yeah, I like this. It's simple, but we can argue it, and someone can argue against it. That's another good thesis, right? Is that someone could try to argue against it. Doesn't mean there's going to be a lot of evidence for it, but it's not just like for sure. It's like, oh, maligns a critic much more harshly. Someone might say no, he maligns, and so we get to try to argue our way into an A, or argue our way into a high mark. So yeah, so sarcastic aplomb, we can use that in the conclusion. So we can say, hey, conclusion or intro. So we can say snarky, facetious tone. And then we can mention sarcastic aplomb. So yeah, I think that's a good thesis. It's a good start. Um, I think it's the hardest thing to do is to read read the poem, reread it, you know, write all this stuff out, and then find a thesis that this points to. Um, and it really does. And we can argue this, within judgment, man and wife. Um, Not the exactness of peculiar parts. You're talking about the poet. And the conclusion, the obvious thing, I think, is always go for the obvious, right? So go for obvious. So is who is Alexander Pope being here? Well, he's being the writer, but he's also being the critic. So writer, because this is fresh, original material, right? He's the wit. But then he's also the critic. But he's sort of critiquing their careers and their day-to-day like choices and lives at work. So that's funny, right? That's probably for the conclusion. So he's both, and then we could talk about, well, perhaps, in the conclusion, maybe we can say perhaps he, um, was more supportive of a writer as opposed to the critic. As a progenitor, which is like a creator, progenitor of original work. And then, original creative work, which is essentially what he's talking about in terms of the writer, the wit. Rather than someone who is a lamenter. Right, simply sort of a complainer, lamenter of I guess it's sort of a misguided career path. I don't know if that makes sense. Complainer or someone who was creative, was clear, or who seeks to merely pass. All right, I like that. It's not bad. So we're sort of saying, it's sort of what I try to paint a picture on is, when you circle the wagons, like a lot of times you want to say sort of the same thing, but you want to change the words up and you want to make a clearer picture. So if you make a point, you sort of paint a clear picture, but then when you drive that point home, like after you introduce the quote, reference the quote, and then pick apart the quote, explicate the quote, different words, different phrasing, line breaks, whatever you're talking about in the thesis, and you're defending that, right? And you're focusing on that. So we're not going to have a bunch of other stuff. We're going to have mostly rhyming and word choice. And then at the end, then when you drive the point home, it's even clearer, and it's even more of sort of like you're making a strong statement. Um, you know, and so the fact that he maligns the critic, now we want to think, well, why would he do that? That's always the big question, right? So in the conclusion, we're thinking why. Multiple reasons. Research. Historical, social, etc. issues of the day in his environment. I want to mention that. Or keep it 100% content, context based. So you can research that stuff and then find some stuff that's really good, that makes sense, and then plug it in. Or you can keep it 100% focused content. Yeah, I like this. Because it's clear, straightforward. And teachers, I don't want to, say that this is bad and they'll just take anything. But I guess what I'm saying is, even though it's simple, we've sort of structured it still in a pretty competent way, as evidenced by his rhyming and word choice. And we're also talking about literary terms, which I think are very helpful in terms of putting in a thesis, that are presented to an overall snarky, facetious tone. I like that we added this because now we're kind of arguing that he's snarky and facetious, so we can throw that stuff in. And there's, I think, three to five. There was a bunch where we can argue, a bunch of points where we can argue that he's actually speaking ill of the critic, even though you think he's being really effusive and encouraging. And then, he maligns the critic much more harshly. Even though it's simple, if we can defend it well, I think we can get us a solid grade. So yeah, that's a good start. And just getting stuff out there. But yeah, we'll get ready to start writing here very soon. All right, thank you.